So I want to welcome you to both the online and the live audience for our launch of the new book, Disability and Political Representation, which is just out from Oxford University Press. It's nice to be back online, at least for reasons of accessibility. And I didn't notice if you mentioned this, Stuart, but the online folks should look at the codes, the QR codes on either side of the main screen for getting into the question process. And I have a tablet here that will bring the questions up for me so we can mix live and online questions as they come in later on. Online is also how we got this launch series started. ISRF began to launch our fellows' new books online during the pandemic, and we're now nearly up to 36 of them. The topic range is impressive, and yet a prominent theme in our fellows' work has been rethinking disability studies in relation to culture and the law. This new book by Elizabeth Evans and Stefanie Reher links the field and the lives of disabled people, to use the identity first term, directly to politics and representation. So to name a few ISRF precursors, and this is in the spirit of intellectual frameworks and not advertising, in his book, An African Path to Disability Justice, Oche Onazi redefines disability justice through Ubuntu, a relational, not individualist notion of personhood, one that also does not require, in Oche's reading, symmetrical capabilities between persons. A few months later, Beverly Clough's book on rethinking mental capacity law undoes the binary contrast between the abled and disabled that weakens respectful care. Elizabeth and Stefanie are looking at the relations between disability and political representation in both directions. And one of their key questions is whether, to quote them, thinking about disability challenges the ways in which we approach the idea of political representation as such. This question intersects with the work of another set of ISRF authors. For example, Gabor Shearing's work on how Hungarian democracy was manipulated into a vehicle for authoritarian state capitalism over the last 15 years, or Peter Newell's work on how democracy will be the essential movement space for a power shift to green energy. Much of this ISRF work takes place on the terrain of the theory of social rights. In her book, Being Sure of Each Other, Kimberly Brownlee offers detailed philosophical reasons for why social rights, rights that emerge from life in common, are more fundamental than individual rights, including the classical liberal right of individual freedom of association. Disability justice is an essential movement on its own terms and part of a common front of struggles for the elimination of exclusionary practices that are also damaging society politically, environmentally, and in other ways. Elizabeth and Stefanie's book offers a combination of nuance and clarity that I find remarkable. Their work is grounded in the social model of disability, which sees society as the producer of disability by imposing ableist frameworks in which capabilities are assessed and judged. They also use other models and see impairment as intersectional with various aspects of the person's identity, and they draw on social movements of traditions of disability definitions and rights. We sometimes take honesty for granted in scholarship, honesty about limits and honesty about the need to multiply perspectives and methodologies, but this honesty really shines through here. The authors and respondents will discuss the book's arguments on the basis of its large set of interviews, but I want to mention two premises that operate especially well in the book. One is that there's no easy line to draw around the disabled community in order to define it, and that this fact, or this variability, is just fine. Their writing is specific about the varied impact that certain forms of politics and ways of doing politics have on particular groups of disabled people, which is one of the strengths of the multiple interviews that they do. And it makes a standardized definition of disability unnecessary as well as wrong. And at the same time, they remain committed to the idea of examining how all disabled people are ultimately affected by a politics that is governed by disableist and ableist processes, institutions, and cultures, providing insights into the relevance of a shared disabled identity as well as its limitations. So I found this subtlety, this complexity illuminating and reassuring. I grew up banging around the relation between care on the one hand and politics on the other. My youngest brother was born with a severe case of cerebral palsy, and we cared for him at home until he was about 20. My mother had and still has a very specific criterion for care. At the time, I was sometimes exhausted by, but am now completely admiring of, her insistence that care aim always at a complete life. Elizabeth and Stefanie's book captures the ethic behind this care, the combination of love and equality, that is, love for equality and love through equality. That experience at home has made it easy for me to see the sheer labor that disability rights and our theme tonight, disability representation, requires, and to pay ongoing homage to it. So I'm grateful to you two for taking what are often private and invisible effects and bringing them into connection with political powers. And we could, I think, at some point, build a world in which protest voters, for example, thinking about the current election in the UK, when protest voters gravitate towards the candidate who's raised a disabled child whom he brings into his public campaign, rather than the candidate who's famous for attacking migrants. So as Stuart, I'm not sure that you mentioned this. The structure is our traditional one, which is that we'll hear from the authors first for 15 minutes or however long you end up needing. And then we'll hear from each of the respondents for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a discussion both in the room here and also to the audience online. Okay, bios. Elizabeth Evans is professor of politics at the University of Southampton. Her work explores the relationships between social movements, political parties, and political representation. Her work has received funding from ESRC, the British Academy, the Government Equalities Office, and the ISRF. She's the author of 3 books and has recently co-edited Confronting Privileges, Intersectionality in Feminist and Queer Movements with Eleanor Lépinard. She's published over 30 articles in a wide range of international peer-reviewed journals on topics that include intersectionality as feminist praxis, diversity, feminist resistance, and gender in news coverage. Elizabeth is a co-founding editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender, has been editor-in-chief of Politics, is the former convener of the ECPR's Group on Politics and Gender and of the Political Science Association's Women in Politics Group. In 2022, she won the Joni Lewandowski Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Political Studies. Our second author, Stefanie Reher, is senior lecturer in politics at the University of Strathclyde. She completed her DPhil at Nuffield College, Oxford, and was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Copenhagen before joining Strathclyde School of Government and Public Policy in 2017 as a Chancellor's Fellow, where she became senior lecturer in 2019. Her research focuses on political representation, behavior, and attitudes, using quantitative methods to study how well public policy reflects the preferences and views of citizens, what explains differences in representation between different social groups and countries, and how it affects individuals' attitudes towards their political system. Her published papers cover topics such as inclusion and diversity among expert witnesses in deliberative mini-publics, and the role of experts in climate assemblies. She currently holds an ESRC New Investigator Grant to study how voters perceive disabled election candidates. It's a pleasure to have both of you with us here today. Thanks for coming. It's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And just to say that Steffi is a reader, soon to be professor, I'm sure, at Strathclyde. Thank you all for coming, both those of you who are here, and I know the many people who are with us online, even if you do have one eye on the England-Denmark match, which I believe is kicking off about now. So this book is really a labor of love and friendship that we have been on together over the last few years. It's got sort of 2 objectives. We first met at a conference, a European political science conference, as the only two people working on disability. We weren't in the same conference panel, but we found each other anyway. And I suppose our book is substantively about why we need more disabled politicians, but it's also why political science as a discipline needs to think more carefully about disability. So that's the sort of other objective. We worked together on a government equalities office funded project on analysing the barriers to elected office. Given that this is going out online, I won't say too much about our experiences with the Government Equalities Office. Safe to say that Liz Truss was the minister at the time that our reports were submitted and were not published for a very, very long time. So it was quite a frustrating experience. In this book, I suppose the main argument is that disability and political representation really matters, and that it's actually it's a matter of life and death when we think about the policies that governments pursue, when we think about the austerity agenda, when we think about the cuts to benefits. Obviously, political representation and MPs isn't the only way of achieving change, and we know that there's been amazing work done by the disability rights movement, but this is one important way in which change can come about. Very often when I tell people that I'm working on disability and political representation, they'll sort of say, oh yes, David Blunkett, as if, you know, if David Blunkett can make it, if one person can make it, then that means that it's accessible for everyone. And one thing that we kind of were committed to in writing this book was to try and systematically detail and analyse the experiences of disabled people as they are marginalised as voters, as members of political parties, as election candidates within political parties, and even once they get elected as well. So I'm going to pass over to Steffi now.
I've got a mic right here. So I'm going to quickly talk about the structure of the book and then some of the kind of major issues and challenges that we faced and tried to address in the book. I think there should be a slide. Yeah, so just to give you an overview, and we're going to now talk very briefly about each of the chapters in our books, but to give you kind of an overview of how we structured it, you see the chapters there in blue, and then we've got the sort of guiding, underlying, theoretical ideas and stages of the representation process that helped us structure it. So we can think about the book as being structured, on the one hand, in terms of different dimensions of representation, which Pitkin has talked about, which are formalistic, descriptive, and substantive representation. So who is allowed to participate in the representative process, who is present in politics, in parliaments, and which groups are addressed and whose interests are represented in politics by politicians and in policy. And then we can also think about the structure in terms of the full representation process from voting, from the experiences of disabled voters, through engaging with political parties, standing for selection and standing for elected office, and then actually being represented in Parliament or serving as a political representative. So in our work prior to writing the book, we've already worked on these different stages. So we really wanted to kind of bring them all together because they hang together so closely and they influence each other, of course. In terms of the methods, it was really important for us to have a true kind of mixed methods design and research design and approach in the book, because we think that different kinds of methods are really suitable to answering different questions that we ask in the book. So just to give you a bit of an overview, we have interviews with over 80 disabled candidates, former candidates and current elected representatives, both at the local level and the national level. also with representatives of disabled people's organizations, and you find those interviews kind of used throughout the book, throughout all the chapters. We then also use existing cross-national survey data from across Europe, so large-scale survey data. We also conducted our own survey and survey experiments in the UK and the US, where existing survey data wasn't sufficient. We analyzed political text quantitatively, qualitatively, including party manifestos, MP speeches, early day motions, and written questions. And you find these basically in different parts throughout the book. Just to address a couple of kind of challenges that we talk about here in our first chapter, disability in politics. The first is how to think about disability and how to measure disability and how to actually identify disabled people more generally, but also disabled politicians specifically. And here we rely on mostly the social model of disability, the idea that it's society that disables individuals through the barriers that that are in place and that haven't been addressed and eradicated. But that also means that disability is kind of a fluid concept, right, in terms of, well, theoretically, but also in terms of measuring it. So what we relied on was basically people's self-identification in surveys, but also when interviewing politicians, and also when counting the number of disabled politicians in office now and previously. So there are some cases where, for instance, a politician would say, I am dyslexic, but they never use the term disabled. So we then decided to only sort of count the politicians who actually use that term. When it comes to the interviews, we interviewed anyone who would self-identify as disabled and would want to speak to us. Now, the second question is then, are disabled a social group? And that's a question that we are asked very often because it's such a heterogeneous group. But we believe that even though this is an idea that's still contested amongst disability scholars as well, to what extent disabled people really kind of represent a unified social group, we believe that disabled people face, or what unites them is that they face ableism or disableism. They face discrimination, stigma in society. They face barriers in different aspects of their lives. And what we actually find is that people with very different kinds of impairments or disabilities often find or experience barriers when doing the same activities, even though the barriers aren't always the same. And we might talk about that a little bit more later on. So while we recognize in the book the heterogeneity across the disability community, we also do believe there is a point in conceiving of them as a politically relevant social group that needs to be studied more in political science.
My turn again. So the central concept that we're working with in this book is political representation. And one of the things that we argue is that the way in which we theorize about and think about political representation is underpinned by ableist, disablest sensibilities, right? And we argue that actually how we think about, how we talk about the idea of representations really shapes who we think can and should be a representative. So we argue that the kinds of ideas that shape political representation are norms that are underpinned by a sort of a reliance on rationality, a very talk-centric approach to politics that has a very definite view of how politics should be conducted, what kinds of bodies should be conducting politics as well. There's also a sort of an idea within studies of political representation that actually you don't need someone from the same social group to represent your interests. They can act on your behalf. But we argue that there's a sort of an unknowability of disabled people's interests, and they aren't sort of crystallized, in the words of feminist theorist Jane Mansbridge. So it's very hard for non-disabled politicians to act on behalf of disabled people. We don't need to look too back far over the recent parliaments in the UK to see that non-disabled politicians have failed to represent the interests of disabled people on any number of different issues. So we argue that the good representation of disabled people really requires disabled representatives. And we try to articulate this idea of experiential representation, the importance of lived experience to the process of political representation, the lived experience of being disabled in an ableist society. We know that disabled people are more likely to have tested and developed solutions to accessibility problems. We know that disabled people are more likely to have broader ranges of thinking about disability on their radar. There may be new ways of doing politics. So it knits together this kind of idea of representation, who the representative is and what they might be doing. We also firmly believe that the sort of historical and ongoing processes of oppression and paternalism that many disabled people experience requires the good kind of advocacy on behalf of disabled politicians who explicitly self-identify as disabled, and that this is underpinned by our argument that disabled people are currently subjects rather than architects of state governance and policy. So we're going to give you some highlights of the various findings from our research when it comes to the experiences of disabled people as voters, as members of parties, as candidates, and then as representatives. So we're going to start with the voting part.
Yes, so that part is in the kind of category of voters and formalistic representation. Who is actually allowed to vote, and to what extent do disabled people vote? I think it's back. So Article 29 of the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, persons with disabilities, says that disabled people have equal rights to participate in public and political life. But we see even among signatories to the convention that that's actually not always the case. So even within the EU, there's still quite a few countries where especially people with mental health conditions and cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities, especially those who are under legal guardianship, actually are disenfranchised. They're not actually allowed to vote. Now this is changing. So in this chapter, we have 3 case studies. We look at Germany, the UK, and the US. And in Germany, this actually only changed in 2019, that voters or citizens under guardianship are now also allowed to vote. But even in countries where they're allowed to vote, it's often very difficult for them. So the Article 29 of the UNCRPD also says that disabled people have the right to free and accessible voting procedures, facilities, and materials, and very often that's not the case. So even in the countries that we're looking at, the UK, the US, and Germany, very advanced democracies, there are still a lot of barriers in the registration and voting processes, including inaccessible polling cards and information, especially where registration is necessary, inaccessible polling stations, even where they're said to be accessible, sometimes that means mostly accessible. There's still a step at the entrance, so they're not accessible. Often there's a lack of information and knowledge among polling station staff to really know how to support disabled voters and what adjustments they're actually entitled to. And often the rules around it about, for example, who is allowed to come into the polling station and help voters is quite confusing. And then even though these are being addressed more and more, there are also step backs in a way. So, for example, in the US, there's been more restrictions on early voting periods post-COVID after they were extended in some states. Voter ID laws coming in, for example, changes in registration procedures that actually make it more difficult for a lot of disabled people to vote. So what we see, potentially partly as a result of this, is that there are turnout gaps, disability gaps, and turnout across Europe and the US. That's where we have most of the data. And these cannot be fully explained yet. So socioeconomic resources might play a role. Disabled people tend to have fewer socioeconomic resources that tend to increase electoral participation, but that doesn't really explain it. So it might be partly due, or it's likely to be partly due to that lack of accessibility, but probably also to a lack of trust in politicians and political processes. So researchers also found that trust tends to be much lower amongst disabled people, potentially because they don't feel represented in politics, because of the lack of, disabled politicians, or appropriate proportionate numbers of disabled politicians, as well as attention to disability issues in policies.
So we also then looked at political parties to see what political parties were doing and to see how disabled people experienced political parties. And we found a range of different barriers to disabled people becoming active within political parties. So as a sort of first entry point, not all the websites are accessible for disabled people. And in fact, one of our findings, and we were pleased to see, was that the Labour Party used an accessibility toolkit on their toolbar on their website. But when I went to look at the Labour Party website yesterday, they'd removed it. So so even some of the findings from relatively recent have been rowed back on, which is depressing. So there's a lack of accessibility in terms of websites, in terms of materials that are available for members. Our interviewees told us that local parties often don't meet in accessible venues. There are norms surrounding political campaigning. The expectations that you'll be out knocking on people's doors means that disabled people are sometimes prevented from joining in, and then this harms their chances of being selected as a candidate. Some disabled people told us about explicit discrimination that they'd experienced within political parties. One woman we spoke to said that she was told that disability, quotes, does not look good on the doorstep, right? They don't want disabled people out campaigning because it doesn't look good on the doorstep. So within that kind of field, there are disability groups active within the major parties, at least within the UK. Some are more or less resourced than others, but they all face a range of barriers, and part of that is getting the central party to take disability seriously. Anyone who's had a quick look at the manifestos that have recently been published will see that there is not much attention paid to disability in this recent set of manifestos, and I've yet to hear anyone talking about disability in this election campaign as well. So let's say you manage to become involved in a political party, you manage to get some sort of experience enough to put yourself forward for selection. We also found a number of barriers to elected office. Again, problems of accessibility, buildings, materials. There are financial implications. It's extremely expensive to put yourself forward as a candidate. You might have to travel around the country trying to find a seat. You might need to take time off of work. You might need to pay for additional costs. Then there's the broader ableist culture in which the campaigning occurs. So people we interviewed told us that they had been told to keep quiet about being disabled, and that one candidate was told that her local party was, quotes, ashamed that she was their candidate. We also found that this problem was particularly acute for disabled women within parties as well. And of course, the UK government had at one point introduced a temporary access to elected office fund to help disabled candidates meet the additional costs. They then, in their wisdom, withdrew that fund and then reintroduced it on a temporary basis, and then withdrew it again, despite our report showing that it really benefited disabled candidates. I would say none of the parties, apart from the Green Party, seems to have any commitment to this in the next election, even though it's a really nominal amount of money that would be required to have this access fund opened up again.
So we talked to a lot of disabled candidates, former candidates, and those who considered standing for selection but then didn't because of a lot of the barriers that experienced. But what we found was that in the interviews that a lot of the experiences with voters were actually rather positive. Often candidates felt that voters really appreciated that they had that lived experience and that it gave them, something to be remembered by. But of course, it's difficult to find out how voters really feel about disabled candidates by talking to disabled candidates. So in order to find out how do voters perceive disabled candidates, do they think about them differently than non-disabled candidates, and do they discriminate against them at the ballot box? We conducted some survey experiments in the UK and the US, where we basically presented respondents with descriptions of fictional candidates who were either disabled or not. So we looked at deaf, blind, and wheelchair-using candidates, in this case, disabilities that are quite well known. But of course, that doesn't cover, the full spectrum of different disabilities. But what we found was really positive and encouraging, actually. So we found that voters perceived disabled candidates as more compassionate, more honest, and more hardworking, which is partly in line with general kind of social stereotypes, but more with the positive stereotypes about disabled people. Whereas we didn't find that voters perceived them as any less competent. They were seen as slightly less strong and authoritative than non-disabled candidates. We also found that voters thought that disabled candidates, probably because of their assumed lived experience, that they would be more competent on issues related to welfare and social security, healthcare, minority rights, and even family and children. So what we found altogether was that actually being disabled didn't seem to have any disadvantage or bring any disadvantage at the ballot box. So those were quite positive results. So it seems from our findings that a lot of the barriers are actually from within parties rather than necessarily, and institutions rather than necessarily from voters themselves. So then moving on from the access to power part to the representing disabled people part in our book, we then asked, to what extent are the interests of disabled people and their preference represented in politics? So we've basically established that the input into politics is biased against disabled people, but is the output also biased? Are the interests or preferences of disabled people represented in the policy-making process? So to answer that question, we first asked whether disabled people actually have distinct policy preferences from non-disabled people, and whether these are reflected equally well by government parties across Europe. So here we use survey data from 25 European countries, from the European Social Survey. And we found that, on average, disabled people actually do hold different political preferences. They tend to be, on average, more left-wing, more pro-redistribution, and more Eurosceptic. We could only look at the policy dimensions that were available in the surveys. But what we also found was that across Europe, on average, government positions are further away from the preferences, the positions of disabled people than those of non-disabled people. And this, in our analysis, couldn't be explained by lower levels of political engagement. Yes, there is a disability turnout gap, but actually disabled people were more engaged in other forms of representation. So it doesn't really seem to be that governments simply don't know what disabled people's preferences are. It seems to be more that they aren't listening to them. Then we also looked at the manifestos of the main UK parties from the 2017 and 19 election. And what we found was that in those years, Labour had the most pledges amongst the parties that we looked at, and they did have pledges related to disabilities on most major policy areas, which was largely a consequence of Corbyn's leadership, where disability was really quite salient. But overall, the attention to disability issues in parties' manifestos was rather low. And as Liz said earlier, it seems to be, if anything, actually going down in this election. So then the question is, well, why is that the case? Is that because there are so few disabled elected representatives? Which then raises the question, well, are disabled politicians more likely to talk about disability issues and actually to talk about their disabled identity when they're in office? So in other words, would increasing the number of disabled representatives actually help us get disabled people's policy interests better represented? And our response to that is yes, maybe unsurprisingly. So we looked at the maiden speeches of the disabled members of parliament in the House of Commons that we could identify since 1866, and other parliamentary activity, including written questions, early day motions, other speeches. And we found that quite a few of the disabled politicians actually very explicitly made reference to their own experiences and said, I have this experience, and therefore, I am qualified to say what the interest and what's in the best interest of disabled people in the country. They sometimes refer to disabled people more generally, and sometimes to the specific type of impairment or disability that they have. But there are also politicians at the same time who kind of left that part of their identity aside and decided to focus on other issues instead. So yeah, that leads us to our conclusions, how to make politics more accessible for disabled people.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a list of recommendations in the conclusion. When I was preparing for this, I did reread most of the book, but I actually didn't reread our conclusion. So I was trying to remember what we actually thought would work. And we based all of our recommendations that are in the book on our conversations with our interviewees who had amazing ideas and suggestions for how to improve politics. And there's lots of different ways in which politics could be improved. I mean, I think one thing that needs to be done is that the House of Commons and political parties need to be recording data on the number of disabled members and disabled candidates in the same way that they're expected to report this data with regards to gender. This will help bring it up, the political gender, I think, if they're expected to kind of report on numbers. We're obviously in favour of reintroducing the Access to Elected Office Fund. We're in favour of introducing accessibility audits for political parties to be held to greater account when it comes to the treatment of disabled members. What else do we think?
So we conducted a lot of the research during the pandemic, and there were a lot of hybrid events, of course, and virtual events, and we found that a lot of the disabled people we talked to found that that was extremely helpful in terms of engaging with political parties, but also actually, for members of parliament to be able to participate better, or, local councillors. But as you all know, we've very quickly seen kind of a return to normal and to having in-person events. And we're very happy that we could hold this event today and in a hybrid way, but because that's something that a lot of the people we talked to really emphasized how helpful that was for them. And we've all learned from that, and we've somehow made it work. So why can it not work when it's not everyone, but just disabled people needing that or benefiting from that? And another thing that came up quite a lot was job sharing for politicians, which again is not only beneficial for disabled people, but for a lot of other people with, for instance, with caring responsibilities. So yeah, shall we conclude there? Yeah.
That was a really wonderful collaborative, interactive overview of what's a pretty substantive book. And there's a lot still left in here in case you feel like you've just heard the whole book. You have not. There's more there. We're going to turn to our first respondent. Sarabajaya Kumar is Associate Professor in Voluntary Sector Policy and Leadership at University College London. She joined the UCL School of Public Policy in January 2010. She holds a PhD in Public Policy and Management and an interdisciplinary undergraduate degree in Sociology and Religion. She has had academic roles at the London School of Economics, University of Oxford, and the Open University. She runs her own research and advice consultancy, serves as Equalities Advisor to the Bar Standards Board, and is a director of Impatience Limited, an organization set up to support and host innovative public benefit projects. She is very active in civil society and contested the 2021 GLA election as a list candidate for the Women's Equality Party, was being one of 11 women selected nationally and the only disabled candidate to be supported in her candidacy by the Activate Collective. Her research interests are in accountability, governance, ethical leadership, intersectionality, and equality. She has recently completed 3 research projects: the everyday lived experiences of disabled university students in London and Osaka during the COVID-19 pandemic, with Professor Beverly Yamamoto at Osaka University, Ableism and the Labor Market, with Associate Professor Colin Provost from the UCL School of Public Policy, and a study on coronavirus intersectionalities of disabled and minoritized groups with Professor Carol Rivas from the UCL Institute of Education. She was recently granted a Butterfield Award in Medicine and Health by the Great Britain Sakakawa Foundation, for which she will undertake research with AI developers in Japan to understand their decision-making processes in relation to health tech and disabled stakeholders. Professor Kumar, it's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Chris, for that really kind introduction, and for inviting me to the launch of Disability and Political Representation by Professors Liz Evans and Stefanie Reher, and to share my reflections. They have said it all, and it is all in the book, but I'm just going to summarise a few reflections and a few things that kind of made me pause, really, for thought. In summary, the book is, as its title suggests, about the role of disability in politics and representation. And for me, its stated aim was really to contribute to the debates concerning how best to make politics more inclusive and responsive to disabled people. As a disability justice activist and very much engaged in politics, both with a small p and a bigger P, this book is a very welcome contribution to this discussion. So I've got 3 reflections that I wish to share. First and foremost, I'd like to say how very much I enjoyed reading your book. It's very well researched, provides important theoretical background for situating your work, and includes the historical context of ableist norms. The research, as you've heard, which employs quantitative and qualitative methods, and actually really innovative methods, is actually beautifully written. It's a joy to read. The work also makes a really important contribution to the discipline of political science, and should be a core text for all those teaching and studying political science, as well as critical disability studies. More broadly, it's a must-read for anyone interested in who represents us, and I think we're all quite interested in that right now. As the authors argue, and I concur, representation matters because who we elect shapes the laws which govern our lives. So that's the kind of the first thank you and reflection. The second is that I turn to your concept of experiential representation. And this is a concept that I understood that you co-created with your disabled respondents. In other words, about representatives with lived experience. This is important, and the authors argue that such representatives can both represent issues and the interests of disabled people, as well as playing an important role in breaking down negative stereotypes. Again, I completely agree with the need for people with lived experience to hold public office. But I reflected a little bit more on the concept, and I also wondered whether experiential representation is a concept that could be broadened to include and emphasise the lived experience of other minoritized representatives. Or would Liz and Stefanie feel that it would lose its salience? So that's a sort of reflection and a question. You've both given me so much food for thought, and in addition to your concept on experiential representation, I propose another. And that is, when I think about my own skills, experience, expertise, I think about both lived and learned. And so the other concept that I'm proposing is because being disabled, our lived experience is not the only relevant experience that I and many other disabled people bring to our roles. And I know that you're not saying that, but I just want to kind of emphasize that that's what often, you talk in the book as well about pigeonholing, and that's often what people do. So important though it is, and indeed for many of us who have acquired and will acquire our impairments later in life, and that includes me, our disability has meant that we've had to develop another string to our bow, another expertise, right? So our impairments and disabilities and how we negotiate the many spaces we inhabit and the barriers we experience in an ableist world, a world built by non-disabled people, are an additional lens and quality, but an additional expertise that we bring. A critically important one, and one that has long been missing from governance conversations at all levels in society. So many people and so many candidates bring experiential representation and expert representation. That's what I would add, really, to the conversation. This is clear from chapter 8, your chapter 8, where you detail disabled Westminster politicians' activities in Parliament between, I think you said 18-something, and I've written 1918, but anyway, you're right. For now, 1918 and 2010. So, for instance, politicians such as Labour's Anne Begg, 1997 to 2010, often drew on her lived experience to highlight issues of workplace discrimination, education, and hotel accessibility, whilst earlier, or perhaps later in the chapter, but earlier chronologically, Conservative Ian Fraser, 1924, with lots of interruptions till 1958, drew on both his lived experience as a blind veteran, as well as his expert experience as chair of Blind Veterans UK, to raise issues of unemployment rates among disabled people, so it was broader, as well as the need to increase the disability pension. This made me wonder, for instance, about the disabled elected councillors in York, and if they had been cast as expert representatives, would the misunderstanding have occurred when the councillors were initially barred from the conversation and the discussions about accessibility? The exclusion was couched in terms of bias rather than recognition that the councillors may have had some knowledge or expertise about the issue. So this is just something to ponder. My third reflection is in relation to the book that presents a mixed and indeed somewhat depressing, although accurate, picture about citizen participation and the experiences of disabled candidates. The latter chimes with the experiences of members of the Disabled Women in Politics cross-party network that I founded, as well as my own experience of contesting the election in 2021, although my own party, the Women's Equality Party, has been incredibly supportive, so I haven't experienced the barriers that many of my colleagues in different parties do. But I did experience the closure of the Access to Elected Office Fund for funding my reasonable adjustments, and that made my contesting the election very expensive and perhaps prohibitively so. Parties' members and particularly selectors are crucial, as Liz has said, for many seeking elected office. They can be facilitators or champions or blockers and barriers. And this, in combination with what you both feel and refer to as the stickiness of accessibility, resourcing and culture, are challenges that many disabled candidates have to navigate. These three themes are, of course, well understood by disabled people in all aspects of our lives. But the reason that this is particularly important is that they are barriers to elected office. And as you both note, equal access to political office is fundamental to democracy, and this is why this conversation is so critical. Disabled people are underrepresented not only in our country, but globally, and without a diversity of candidates with a variety and breadth of experiences, We just can't make the best decisions for our society. That said, what I found most heartening and a cause for optimism was the research on voter preferences in relation to disabled candidates, and I quote, "Voters have very few, if any, negative stereotypes, attitudes and perceptions towards disabled candidates, and instead perceive their experience of navigating barriers and marginalisation in their everyday lives as an asset." An asset. This message needs to be shared widely, and particularly with political parties. Disabled candidates are assets, not liabilities. A final thought is about leadership, which I don't think has a great deal of attention, or at least explicitly, in the text. Non-disabled political leaders are incredibly important in this conversation. They have the power to change the journeys and trajectories of disabled people seeking election to public office. This is very clear from conversations we regularly have in the network, in the Disabled Women in Politics network, but also from my research, which I've just come back from Tokyo last night, so I'm a bit jet-lagged, but I had 2 incredible conversations with profoundly disabled parliamentarians in the Japanese parliament, which is called the Diet. Having leaders at all levels in parties, but also the party leader supporting disabled candidates, is vital to changing the culture, because you talk about culture, through symbolic representation. Having this support also allows and facilitates disabled politicians to represent their constituents, both place, communities of place, but also the wider community, the disabled community, with confidence. So those are my reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Much appreciated. Next and final respondent is Dr. Alison Wilde, who is, you'll correct me if this is out of date, Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Northumbria University in Newcastle. She has also taught at Leeds Trinity University as a senior lecturer in sociology, at the Open University, Leeds Beckett University, Bangor University, the University of York, University College Dublin, and the University of Leeds. I can't see your face, so I don't know how many of these are wrong. We'll talk later. Her research covers a range of issues on media and culture with a special interest in gender and in disability. Her first book was Film, Comedy, and Disability, Understanding Humor and Genre in Cinematic Constructions of Impairment and Disability, which came out with Routledge in 2018. And her second book, In Process, Performing Disability, is a study of equality, diversity.
Performing diversity, sorry.
Performing diversity.
Yeah, sorry about
that. I don't think it's your fault. I think it's my fault. Performing Diversity, a study of equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. She is a series editor of the Peter Lang book series, Disability, Media, and Culture. She co-founded the Me at CCSA Disability Studies Group and co-founded and co-convenes the British Sociological Association's Disability Studies Group. Alison, many thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to read what I think is an excellent book, something that I think the disabled people's movement and disabled people generally need to get these conversations started. It's hard to know where to begin. And I think you've said an awful lot of things which take that debate further, some of which, well, all of which I agree with, which leaves me kind of a bit not knowing what to start with, even more than I already was, if you know what I mean. Sorry, a bit tired. The first thing I want to say is I am fairly firmly located within disability studies, and I think you lay out your position really well in that you do start by going through giving a really a really good summary, which is both complex but clear and easily accessible of the major debates in disability studies, whilst actually leaving them behind to do what you do best. And even though I know that's not particularly what you identify with, I think it's actually a really important part of the book, not least for students of disability studies. So I'm trying to do things outside of what you just said, sorry. So I do think that this book actually is a very valuable a very valuable contribution to disability studies itself, in that it manages to encapsulate those and go beyond it. And you mentioned some of the concepts that are in there that I think bring new tools to critical disability studies and disability studies. The one which you said, the experiential. Sorry, I've forgotten the whole concept now. Experience. Sorry, but yeah, and within that model goes kind of deeper to the symbolic and the descriptive. And I read that with great interest, and I think it began to make me think of applications in my own chosen area of research, being culture and media, and how much this maps on to work in that area. You also discussed stereotypes at some length, which I thought was quite novel and adds to the literature on stereotypes of disability, again, which goes beyond the application that you have here for politics to inform other areas of disability studies. So I want to thank you for that, because, yeah, I think those things are really important. And there are far too many to mention in that respect. There's quite, as each chapter goes on, it's almost like, oh, how many more ideas am I going to have to grapple with? But at the same time, it's, as you said, it's written really beautifully, and I think it's accessible to a general audience, which is hugely important for such a project. But also to students. I'd have no hesitation in, even though it's not politics that I teach on, particularly those first two chapters on disability studies, ironically enough. So I think a really important thing to say, given a few of the conversations we were having beforehand, is I don't know your positionality as researchers, and there are ongoing debates, which I imagine most people know about how much disabled academics should, non-disabled academics should speak for disabled academics. And whatever your positionality is, I think that that this is a great act of allyship. But you said it was a labour of love when you started off, and it clearly shows throughout. And even though I didn't know it was going until I kind of got further on, it brings together so many disparate things so cleverly, I think. I have to say I do have a favourite chapter, which I'm going to keep going back to in terms of the surprise I had about the findings that are there, which is the one about voter kind of attitudes towards disabled politicians. And I did want more, but I thought there was so much there anyway, so I think that's a huge contribution. But I found myself wanting, I'm sure your data set will allow for this, I hope so. I found myself wanting to know, would they be so positive about a disabled woman as a disabled man, or a disabled person from a minoritized ethnic community? And it became ever more important as I was reading that chapter. It's not a criticism, by the way. It's a kind of a need to know more. As somebody who's written, as you have, quite a lot on gender, and you, I just found, I thought, how gendered are these attitudes? So, and as I said, racialized and everything else. So I was astounded by the by the sheer amount of data in there. And I'm mainly a qualitative researcher, so I found it really surprising that the chapter that I was most interested in was the one that was based on quantitative research. Yeah, a bit upsetting in a way. So I'm trying to read my writing here. Like I said before, I think the literature review was really informative, and as a sociologist, I particularly valued your discussion of political kind of philosophers, old and new, and as also a feminist scholar, I was really pleased to see so many feminist writers in there as well. Sorry, that's just personal. What else? I've talked about voter preferences. I suppose the other thing that I wondered if you thought about, so more of a question, and I kept kind of writing in the margins, what about David Cameron when we're talking about the experiential stuff and him being called Disability Dave by a lot of, in a sarcastic manner, by a lot of disabled people. But also when we're talking about qualities, traits of stereotypes and all that type of thing, or stereotype traits, I was thinking, what about that thing that's going to come in the next couple of weeks? I think it has already, and happened last time, and the election before, but are they electable? And even though there might be positive attitudes towards disabled MPs, it's like I kind of wanted a bit more on how media ideas of, I know it's too much, you've already done enough in the book to be fair, but it's like those discourses. I looked at the papers yesterday morning, and all the papers were trying to sell the Tories again to us, which, you know, no offence to anybody, but this is exactly what happened last time. And of course, I don't know what the effect is, but I'm sure it has some effect. So, this idea of electability, I think, probably was something that was playing on my mind a little bit. Sorry about this. I did. One thing I thought you did touch on in the earlier chapters about you made it very clear that disabled people are a very diverse group, and I think there was also a hint that disabled people politically quite often don't agree as well, and I think that continues to be true. So what I wanted to say to you about is a lot of the models that you presented in there, like the descriptive and symbolic, which you'll have to read to find out about, is really, I think, really useful for us in campaigning groups. Like when we're asking for particular things, to think more critically about that. And from my own kind of research interest, one of those things is people always kind of say, in terms of media representations, where's the disabled actor? Where's the disabled actor? And kind of, which is only kind of one-dimensional, and it's like, what about the story? What about who wrote the story? What about the symbolic value of this representation? So it's almost like, I do think there are things in the book that the movement itself can extrapolate to think about its own version of disability politics. I don't know if you agree, but given that you're more of an activist than I am, but an activist, if you agree that some of those models for discussing what it is we're actually wanting out of disabled people in politics, I think that also has value for the disabled people's community.
It's complex, because reading your chapter about the different disabled politicians and how much they wanted to kind of out themselves or not, I reflected on that a lot and thought, well, actually that's okay. And so I don't know, I think it's complex, and it's really, because we've got so few disabled politicians as well, both at local and national level, it's almost too much to ask of somebody. I mean, it's, you know, I clearly am someone of intersectional positionality, right? I'm a woman with heritage from the global majority and disabled. And sometimes I feel that is a huge labour and weight to carry. So, I mean, I don't think probably I'm speaking to you, but these are the things that were going in my mind.
That's just as important an issue anyway. And on that topic, I think that actually one thing that struck me about that data and what on their maiden speeches, which is really interesting, is how none of it was about the collective. Even though I welcome people saying, breaking that normativity, it's like, they didn't seem like many people. I mean, there are very, very few people disabled people in politics who have talked about the collective. There are some. I mean, in the Lords, we've got Jane Campbell, for example, who's done an awful lot for disabled people. But it's like how much fear is there of actually declaring your political affiliation with disabled people, which again is another outstanding question, I think. So.
I do think peers have, in a way, a bit more independence. So Lord Chinquin from the Conservatives have also done quite a lot on disability, and so I think.
Although you have Alf Morris and the chronically sick and disabled People's Act as well, and so he was, and that was quite some time ago. So he was collectively orientated. He didn't. I mean, I don't know if he suffered for it because I didn't know him or anything. But yeah, but there's not many, are there?
No, and this is why I talked about non-disabled politicians being really important, and more so than allies. Actually, they have a responsibility. We are almost 25% of the population, right? That's a huge minority not to have a voice at the national or local levels, really. I mean, I'm very proud that through the Disabled Women in Politics Network, which is a cross-party network, we had, I haven't got the latest figures for this May election, but we had 11 women elected to political office, and these were women, part of our network, who were fully discouraged by their parties. But
by the way, the York thing, I do know quite a lot about that because I lived in York and I know one of those councillors, so I'm not going to say anything because I won't want to embarrass her, but it's quite problematic. I don't live in York anymore, but I've wondered at certain points whether having those disabled councillors there is actually almost, I'm sorry to throw something else in, but I'm wondering if that actually strengthens their capacity to keep ignoring disabled people's quite loud protests in the area. So, and that's been so for quite a long time.
I did write to them, actually, about that incident, just to show solidarity. But, yeah, difficult. I don't know if you're wanting to respond to us at all.
Well, thank you, Alison, first.
Thank you to both of you for your really generous comments and engagement with our work, and we're just both thrilled that you really liked it. We were extremely nervous about what you might say about the book. We have perhaps been playing it a bit safe and only ever presented our research to other political scientists who don't tend, on the whole, to know that much about disability. So perhaps we haven't been challenged on some of the things that we should have been thinking about and could have been thinking about. And I think the idea of expertise and the pressures that come with always being called upon to disclose your own experiences, that's certainly something that came up in the interviews, people saying, I'm fed up of constantly having to explain myself to people in order to make political points. I suppose the idea of expertise in this country, at least, is a bit tainted. Like, we're all fed up of experts, right? So I suppose in my head I would have discounted expertise. But I think I really like that kind of expertise, particularly those who have expertise in disability politics, right? I know several disability rights campaigners who aren't disabled, who have been MPs, let's say. And I think that that's hugely important. I suppose our focus on experiential representation was simply because out of everyone we interviewed, when we said to them, you know, do you think it's important to have more disabled representatives? And they'd say yes. And we'd say, well, and why do you think that is? And all of them said, because of it was the first thing they went to. Lived experience of disability is critical in terms of legitimacy, in terms of making us feel like these are spaces that we could be in if we wanted to, that our voices are, you know, that we're at the table, right? That we're being heard, that someone is there thinking about these issues. And I think because of the fact that at the governmental level, at least in the UK, there's such a complicated process with regards to disability policy making and who's responsible for it, and it being often left in the sort of work and pensions sphere rather than thinking kind of disability policy and anyone actually, you know, taking responsibility for disability policy. This kind of, I suppose, there was more urgency for and a greater demand for then lived experience as the kind of first, maybe if we think of lived experience as the first step, and then building on that with expertise. But yeah, I like that point. And I suppose whether or not we would broaden it to include others, I'm a bit nervous about that. And in part, that's because other traditionally marginalised groups, and here I'm thinking about women because that's, you know, the group I've done most work on. So the Labour Party are no longer using all women shortlists because the majority of their MPs are women. Their issues and interests have been crystallised to a certain extent. The party takes it seriously. I'm not saying there isn't problems with sexism in the Labour Party, but there's a knowledge and awareness of those issues, and I don't think the same is true for disabled people yet. And so where perhaps women can look to male allies and male politicians because they know how their sisters might act, I'm not sure the same is necessarily true around disability yet, I think.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. I want to just quickly say a few things about the chapter on stereotypes and voters' perceptions of disabled candidates. So we were very happy about those findings, of course, despite being, you know, objective researchers. You know, finding that voters don't seem to discriminate badly against disabled candidates is a positive finding. I think everyone would agree. There are other studies on this by other researchers that have found more negative stereotypes and attitudes. So I think a lot more research is needed on that. And also we looked at very well-known types of disabilities where, on purpose, but you know, where voters would kind of have a fairly good idea about how candidates would kind of go about negotiating and navigating the barriers. So looking more at different kinds of disabilities that are maybe less well known and where general levels of stigma are higher would be quite important as well, just to also not give the message like everything's fine. We don't need to do anything about negative stereotypes because there aren't any. That's not what we're saying. There might still be such stereotypes in the population. And the other thing is that, of course, our study was a survey experiment with fictional candidates, and there wasn't much other context, which is kind of the nature of, you know, this method of survey experiments. But what you said about the media was so interesting because what we've seen ourselves, you know, and probably all of us, you know, over the last years, but also what disabled politicians and candidates told us was that they did experience quite a lot of backlash from the media in some cases, and I think we all know examples of that, of the media asking, you know, well, can they do it, and sort of perhaps framing a disability more in the sense of a lack of ability, which we don't really know what that does in the heads of voters. And it might be quite different. You know, it might lead to more of kind of an urge to elect disabled people if you yourself are disabled and you're offended by that portrayal of disabled people. But it might also be that other people are influenced by that and doubt the ability of disabled politicians to do the job. That's definitely possible. So that's definitely something that we also want to do more research on. Same with intersectionality as well. So there's definitely a lot more to do. Hopefully we've motivated other people to to do more research on this as well.
Definitely, you have. Let me bring in a question from the online sector. Michael asks, I was wondering if the authors had thoughts on the intersection between ageism and ableism in politics. Ageism and ableism.
Yeah, I think we see quite a lot of that. I think in, especially again in the media, I think that's quite often kind of conflated in a way. And I think, well, we haven't studied it, but my perception is that ageism is a lot more accepted, kind of socially accepted, than ableism in a way. So quite often we see, comments like, "Oh, politicians are too old; they can't do this or that anymore." When actually, what they can't do is, something that a lot of young disabled people can't do either, but doesn't matter, right? I mean, to bring the example of Donald Trump, who's not exactly an ally of the disability community, but then he actually, in a way, experienced this where people were criticizing him for not being able to lift a glass anymore, and people were saying, well, how can he be a president if he can't lift a glass anymore? Well, why does that matter for being a political representative, right? I mean, I'm not trying to defend him, but I think it's quite often kind of conflated and intermingled. And I think not to say that, ageism is legitimate, but I think it's often seen as a lot more legitimate than outright disableism.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add to that, I completely agree. The only other thing I'd add to that is that it's quite interesting in terms of when you think about it in terms of political representation, old people are exceptionally well represented and disabled people aren't. Is I suppose, just something I'd note on that.
Yes, excellent. Over to you in the live audience. Questions or comments?
Hi, yeah, I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I know nothing about the topic, but I'm just going to ask a question to find out a bit more about what I didn't hear so much about in the presentation, which was about really the comparative element. So you have this incredibly conceptually rich, empirically rich study, but as I understood it, it addresses 3 different countries, and I didn't really get a grasp, apart from this example relating to Germany and the voting, the voting rights issue. I'd be really interested to hear more about the differences and similarities, as well as the kind of similarities that seem to have come out of this work.
Well, you might be interested to hear more about it, but you won't be able to hear more about it. So perhaps we should have been a bit clearer. The book is mainly about the UK. We have 2 comparative chapters, right? We've got the candidate survey experiment, the US and UK, and we also have our voting rights chapter, which is Germany, the US and UK. And part of the reason why we wanted to focus on the UK is because, ironically, despite the last 15 years, the UK is pretty advanced in terms of its conversation around disability and politics and political representation. And so we thought that it made quite a rich case study to see actually what is going on in the UK. And although we did find some positive things, which we've tried to highlight in the book, we also obviously identified a number of barriers and problems that exist, not just in politics, quite rightly, but elsewhere as well. So perhaps we've slightly missold it. And to be fair, I think the front cover slightly suggests it's a comparative European book. This is a picture of the European Disability Parliament. Yeah, I don't know if you would add.
Yeah. So just to add to that, what we see, for example, in Britain, like the Access to Elected Office Fund, which is still in place in Scotland at the moment and has been in place kind of UK-wide, and I think now in New Zealand exists. But other than that, the UK is really the only country that has a fund like that. Also, the fact that all the major parties in the UK have disability groups, that's something that is really unheard of in most other countries, including European democracies. When it comes to voter accessibility as well, I mean, our conclusion was was basically that Germany, in this case, is quite behind the UK. I mean, it's easier because voter registration isn't necessary. But then in terms of the expectation that polling stations are accessible, in the UK and the US as well, there is that firm expectation there, even if it's not always properly implemented, whereas in Germany, there's official information saying, well, not all polling stations are accessible, so if you need one, you have to find out where you can find an accessible one, and then you have to get your polling card in order to be able to vote there or vote by mail, so it's all really complicated. So yeah, generally our kind of comparative conclusion would be that the UK is very advanced compared to most other countries, but again, we don't have a lot more kind of really in-depth comparative research in this book yet.
And I should say I went to the Czech Parliament and also to the Finnish Parliament, and I was really struck by the fact that in the Czech Parliament, when I asked them about disability, they thought it was extraordinary that anyone would be interested in this, and they sort of responded when I asked them about disability access and disabled politicians. They just sort of responded with, "Do you know how many women there are here?" And I was like, well, yes, I do, because I've worked on that, but this isn't about women. Well, it's about disabled women in part, but, it was a sense of this is such a minority issue that they could not believe that I was there asking them about it. And by way of contrast, the Finnish Parliament, they had made every effort to try and make this building accessible, but their focus was only on disabled members of the public being able to access the building. It was a sense of we're opening democracy up to disabled citizens, and the focus was on making it totally accessible. And when I asked them about disabled politicians, they were a bit sort of, oh, well, I'm not sure whose responsibility that is. So it was interesting, the two different kind of responses to it, which again, ironically, makes the UK somewhat advanced on these kinds of issues.
And yet there's a line, at least in your book, I can't remember whether it's a paragraph, about Uganda, which was really interesting because my recollection is because of conflict, etc., they've got a large number of disabled people. In fact, post-conflict zones have a large number of disabled people, and they have really sort of started to tackle this or think about this. And what I would say as a reader of your book is that whilst you're saying it wasn't comparative, what was really interesting was, I think, pretty much each chapter could stand alone, and within the chapters there were, the comparators and the little vignettes and the stories. So it's worth a read. Get it.
Yeah, that was a better answer.
I went to my local hustings on Monday night, and it's an inner London constituency. There were 7 candidates, and questions were submitted by scribbling on a post-it note, which went into a hat. And one of the organisers made sure my question got asked, which was, as a candidate, what do you pledge to do to ensure disability equality for people of all ages and backgrounds? And all but 2 of the answers were very, very paternalistic and, social care and the NHS. And the Tories, of course, were back to work and without the fundamental structure being in place to ensure that works for everyone. And there was only one candidate that sort of said, right, well, actually, my party's got this policy, and this policy, and we think that together that will make a big difference. And it wasn't the party that I was expecting it to be, actually. And what I came away feeling was very much like the overwhelming, like people just still seeing disabled people as being done unto and needing to be looked after rather than enabled and included. And I wondered if your research threw up anything similar, or if the other speakers have any comments on that, please, if that's all right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question, and I think that's also a big motivation for our book and for doing this research, the idea that disabled people should be part of the decision-making processes and not just, be there as kind of subjects that, decisions are made about. And quite often, we've actually got the comment where, well, a lot of politicians have experiences as carers or as healthcare professionals, so they know what disabled people need. And as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of disagreement with that in the disability community. So yeah, that's definitely something that we encountered a lot. But yeah, where there's really strong resistance against that by the disabled community, disabled politicians, and us as well.
Just to add to that, I mean, having read the party manifestos, I mean, there's just very, very little about disability in any of them, really. It's really disappointing what attention they do manage to pay to disability, and it's framed as, tightening up benefits. There are people who are claiming these benefits who aren't not really disabled. From one party, and others, talking about getting disabled people back into work and the disability pay gap. But yeah, I mean, I was quite struck, I suppose, by the fact that the Lib Dem manifesto had a kind of section around rights of disabled people and talked a bit about enshrining the UN Convention on the Right to People with Disabilities, like as a pledge within their manifesto. I mean, obviously, as we know from our work on voting and inaccessibility, even if you're a signatory to that, doesn't mean you actually do it, right? So it's also being aware of the kind of lip service that's often paid to some of these topics.
We are running low on time, so I'm going to read two questions from online. There are two questions here that we'll take together, and then we'll have one final round from the panel. The two here are, in the current political context, it seems like a bit of an oversight to not discuss social class in relation to disability. Do the authors have any thoughts? And the second question online is, did you encounter new and interesting attempts by political parties to support disabled members and recruit potential disabled candidates? So I imagine that's in the current electoral context. And then there were two in the back, if you want to just blurt them out quickly.
No, I just wanted to just make two very, very quick questions by way of clarification about methodology in the book, which I haven't yet done the justice of reading yet, and then just to ask a general question. So, first of all, you mentioned in your talks about particularly, I suppose, with your qualitative research actually speaking to people who were disabled. Of course, we know that there's a medical as well as a social definition of disability. So I'm hoping that these were people who actually self-identified rather than appeared to be disabled, who were sampled. And the second question is that, in terms of methodology, was, I've actually forgotten it, so let's just get straight to the question. Part of my disability actually is my memory sometimes plays up. So the question is, the political terrain right now is a little bit scary to people who look like me. I really feel that intersectionality actually is critically important, because I have multiple identities. I'm both disabled, both physically and mentally, although I don't look disabled. I'm also from an ethnic minority, and particularly in my experience of the NHS recently, I've had both of those discriminations actually directed at me. So I feel we're in a terrain now where the hard right, seem to have the upper hand, have the whip hand in politics. And even the Labour Party talks about being a centrist party, but it is the hard right that keep on dragging all the political parties towards the right in terms of politics. My fear is that the Labour Party manifesto actually is so timid and in some cases vacuous on equality issues that when in government, they'll more or less continue doing what they've been doing in opposition, and that is simply shedding any policies that might actually be bold and radical in terms of equalities, because it doesn't want to upset the Daily Mail. So my question here basically is, are you in any way concerned about the backlash that we're now witnessing, not just in Britain, but across Europe, against the very concept of equalities and social justice?
Mine is really quick, and I think it was already sort of implied. So first of all, thank you all. It's really fascinating. My question was around this aspect of both visible and invisible disabilities. So for example, the experiment you talked about, you deliberately took some kind of like well-known forms of disability, all visible. But then in terms of invisible disabilities, well, number one, you may want to consider that there might already be politicians who are already disabled but have not disclosed it to the public or even to their peers. And the second point is whether or not it will make a difference if somebody comes out and disclosed an invisible disability to whoever, whether that's the public or their peers. And so when you're researching disabilities within the context, within that context, which disability do you consider?
It's okay. Yeah, a very quick question. So my question is about ableist institution, and this happens, I guess, in a different level, and some of the discussion were about party politics. But I'm really curious what happens in terms of when once the candidate actually was elected and then actually start to work as MP. So in terms of how to what extent sort of like parliamentary rules are accommodating. For example, some of the issues, this is I'm not very familiar with in terms of divisions, or is there what kind of like, are they allowed to use proxy vote? And is there any discussion to sort of accommodate or like expand, the ability for maybe not just disabled MPs, but also everyone to maximize their capacity, and partly because this is not just the issue of, the responsibility of disabled MPs, but everyone's responsibility to allow people to fulfill their potential.
Ask one of you to respond for 60 seconds, then we'll stop, and then we'll discuss outside in the patio where there are drinks and pizza on its way.
Do you want to go? Should I go? Okay, all right. I have been designated. Thank you all so much for your questions. I don't have much time, so I would just say, first of all, yes, we only interviewed politicians who self-identified as disabled. That was really important to us, and that kind of leads me to the second point on invisible disabilities. So we had quite a few politicians who have invisible disabilities, but of course then we really depended on them kind of coming to us and responding to our call for interviewees. We know that there are politicians with invisible disabilities who haven't kind of disclosed them, so to say. We don't know who they are, how many. It's kind of, we've heard this from other people we interviewed. What happens when they disclose? I've done some preliminary research that suggests that voter reactions are quite positive on that, but don't hold me to that yet because it's very preliminary. What we would argue, definitely we recognize that intersectionality is extremely important. We've worked on gender and disability, but obviously all kinds of other dimensions, including social class as well, are really important. In terms of social class, a lot of the financial barriers can be quite similar and kind of compounding when it comes to standing for office. That's why it's important to have more than just one or two disabled representatives, right? Because one or two cannot represent the whole diversity that we have in the disability community, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, class, political views, all kinds of dimensions. That's why there need to be more than just a token few.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel, and many thanks to you for your excellent questions and for the questions online and for the ones that I wasn't able to get to. Thanks very much, you all.